Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today we'll be exploring the academic taboo concerning consciousness. With me is Professor Marjorie Woollacott, who is an emeritus professor of Neuroscience and Human Physiology at the University of Oregon. She is the co-author of the textbook, Motor Control, Translating Research into Clinical Practice, and she is also author of a new book called Infinite Awareness, The Awakening of a Scientific Mind. Welcome, Marjorie.
Thank you, Jeffrey.
I was struck in your book about how you, as a neuroscientist, discovered there was a taboo against discussing meditation, when it seems to me at this point there must be hundreds, if not thousands, of controlled studies concerning meditation. I thought parapsychology had a taboo, but I never imagined there would be one with regard to meditation.
Yes, and you raise a really interesting point about the whole topic of meditation. And one thing I should mention is that, first of all, if you couch meditation in other terms, like mental training, then you can get that into some of the major academic journals. But that's because then it becomes a little bit more materialistically oriented, where we're simply training our brain. And therefore, we can talk about that in academic circles. But when you talk about meditation as truly a way of quieting your mind to allow perhaps some sort of like wider awareness to come in, that's when it becomes like a taboo to really talk about. And I think that's fascinating to see that difference.
Yeah.
And I find that being a neuroscientist and a materialist before I actually got into this area of research and began to meditate, I also have a certain sympathy for those people that are still materialists. And I should say that when I was like 18 to 20 years old, and I was interacting with my family members, and we would have a reunion. Very often they would be talking about spiritual matters amongst themselves, and I and my uncle, who was a PhD from, I think it was MIT, would very often get into our own little corner of the room, and we would talk about how those people were weak-minded, and we were the ones talking about the real information in the universe. So I see that that's how a materialist views things. And I notice now that when I tried to begin to do research on meditation, in my very first article that I tried to publish with a graduate student, we would start out with one of the major journals that we felt this work could go into. And we would get rejected from that journal to another, to another, to another, until we finally got to journals related to things like alternative and complementary medicine. And then finally, our article would be accepted. But the major journal editors often would not even send the article out for review, because they would say, this is not mechanistic neuroscience. This is simply some sort of observational data, and it's not good enough for us. Except that my previous studies that I had published on motor control and rehabilitation were using very, very similar paradigms, and those were accepted instantaneously into these journals. So I realized there were like two different sides of the brain that these people were talking out of. When it was about balance control and rehabilitation, that was fine for their journal. But if I used the same paradigm on meditation, that was no longer acceptable.
And why do you think that is?
I think it's because the predominant philosophy that we scientists have all been brought up in since we were probably in junior high and high school is the materialist Newtonian paradigm. And that is our complete worldview. And anything outside of that paradigm is considered suspect. And I think when somebody tries to break into that paradigm and say, wait a minute, this isn't adequate, there is a fear that arises because you are challenging the person's whole worldview. And you can imagine if that worldview crumbles, where will you be? So I think that there is a certain element of that, and also that it probably is also this issue of religion and science. People think that anything that actually challenges our materialist worldview is somehow religious in nature and therefore is also suspect because that is non-scientific. Rather than saying maybe some of these phenomena are actually part of our reality system and we just need to expand beyond materialism to include consciousness. And it's not that it becomes religious, but it simply is including phenomena that are actually out there and observed by scientists.
In the 19th century, scholars like William James, Sir Charles Richet, a Nobel laureate in physiology, Sir William Crookes, Sir Oliver Lodge, some of the leading physiologists, physicists, and psychologists of their era were all intensely interested not only in consciousness, but in the question of survival of consciousness after the death of the physical body. Yet something happened to dampen that interest.
You're right, and I think that it seemed to happen in the early 1900s. And I think, first of all, I should say that even when William James was talking about those things, he also knew that there were materialist scientists out there that would question him. And I think when he wrote his book, Varieties of Religious Experience, he talks about those people that say that meditation and transformational experiences are due to pathology, basically. So he recognized that there were still those skeptics at that time. But then what seems to happen, as you were commenting on, is that around the early 1900s, something else began to happen. I think it was this, what we would often call in science, the Skinnerian point of view, the stimulus response point of view in psychology and in neuroscience, where we began to take everything down to that neuronal perspective of input and output being the major way that we look at behavior. And for whatever the reasons, that was dominant until the 1960s, 1970s, et cetera. And I grew up in that era where we literally did not want to acknowledge that anything else like a consciousness beyond the activity of neurons on our brain could possibly exist.
Some people say that it was the Council of Trent, where the church sort of defended its domain. Anything having to do with consciousness was the province of the church, and science could have everything else.
Yeah, and I think that that's also definitely true. And I think what people say is that at that time, the church was doing things like beheading people, burning up at the stake. They were doing terrible things if they actually believed that, in fact, the earth was not the center of the universe. And what I think we found is since then, the scientists have felt what that schism felt like to them back then. They've carried that with them, and they want to be sure that we keep anything that even smacks of a little bit of spiritualism outside of their domain and not even to discuss it. So they have actually defined science very narrowly and have considered it only related to the material universe, even though the universe may be much, much broader than that.
And as a result, it seems as if a lot of empirical evidence gets discarded. I talk to people occasionally, and they say, well, there's no evidence whatsoever for parapsychology. So I cite various articles, and then they'll say, well, I'm so busy. If it's not in a mainstream scientific journal, I can't afford to pay attention to it.
Yes, and you're right. And I think that's one real issue. And I've noticed that myself. Before I actually had my first experience in meditation, I never even would think of looking in PubMed, again, this major medical index, for subject matter like near-death experiences or energy healing, Reiki, things of that sort. I would just assume that there would be nothing there because we scientists would never study it. And I was shocked when then after I began to meditate and I became curious, I then went to PubMed and I found that there were articles like again and again on energy healing, on Reiki, on near-death experiences that actually showed that these are phenomena that have been carefully studied and have actually been shown to exist and be valid forms of in energy, the case of energy healing, a valid form of healing. It does work.
What would be your advice today to a young graduate student who wants to do let's say, a dissertation in one of these areas?
Wow. So I think the first thing I would say to them, and I think most neuroscientists would say this to them, is be sure that you have the major topic of your dissertation in something that is considered credible to your materialist colleagues and your professors that you're working with. And then perhaps have an additional area that you can begin working on that begins to try to perhaps expand that into the area of parapsychology or consciousness or something like that. But I say that because I have learned that to get tenure at a major university, you need to actually have the support of everyone in your department and at higher levels of your college and your university administration. And if they see something that they feel might actually reduce their credibility, they will not even let you touch that topic because they are always thinking about their own fellow scientists. So show that you're credible and that you are a good scientist following the usual scientific method in regular domains of science, and then begin to expand that into other areas, because your own credibility will then, in the one area, will go over into the credibility in other areas as well.
Isn't it strange, though, that such attitudes exist when you consider that going back over 100 years, some of the greatest scientists, the most acclaimed Nobel laureates, people like William James, who's regarded as the father of American psychology and was deeply interested in all of these topics, that now they're considered no longer credible.
And I totally agree. And here's something else that I am trying to do actually to remedy that. Gary Schwartz, a faculty member at the University of Arizona, and I are co-founding a new academy called the Academy for the Advancement of Post-Materialist Sciences. And we are bringing onto the board of that academy major professors and scientists who have been working in the paranormal area, really looking at research on whether consciousness is fundamental, into our group of members of this academy. And one of our primary aims is to support young scientists who want to go into this area of research, and perhaps talking to their committees and their departments about the validity of the research that they are doing, so that we can support them in moving through the academic environment and getting beyond some of those barriers that young professors have had in the past, where they weren't able to get tenure because people said this is not valid research.
Yeah. Now, and I assume you're really talking about young scholars who want to research meditation, not reincarnation.
Exactly, right. And that's an interesting point. And yet, here we had a major professor in a psychiatry group at a medical school in Virginia, Ian Stevenson, who was researching reincarnation, and he did that after he actually had his position at the university well established.
And with independent funding.
And with independent funding. That is the other issue that you're just bringing up here in terms of a taboo. Most scientific organizations, for example, governmental organizations like National Institutes of Health, National Science Foundation, will not fund studies of that sort. We do have our National Institute of Alternative and Complementary Medicine, which does do some research and funds some research projects, but they tend to be relatively conservative because there are scientists that are actually evaluating those projects to see if they consider them appropriate for real studies. So what you typically have to do, as you were mentioning, is go to private foundations to actually get this sort of research funded.
Yeah. As you know from our prior conversations, I have a doctoral diploma in parapsychology, and I got it well over 30 years ago. Nobody subsequently has received a diploma that says parapsychology. In fact, nobody before me either. And it makes me feel very lonely. Like, how many hundreds of years of people researching meditation and near-death experience will it take before parapsychology is brought into the academic realm, even though the field is already more than 130 years old?
Yes. And I don't know what the solution is, except to say I think some, maybe even Nobel Prize winners, said something about how science advances often one death at a time.
Funeral by funeral.
Funeral by funeral. So that is one of the issues, that when you are trained in a particular worldview, it's very hard to give that up within your lifetime. And luckily there are young scientists that are coming up within our ranks that are beginning to challenge those sorts of things. And one of the hopes for me is this. I realized that I just found this book called Transcendent Mind, I believe, that is by Iman Sparus and Julia Mossbridge,
Oh, yes.
published by the American Psychological Association.
Yes.
And to me, that is a major breakthrough that one of our major organizations, the American Psychological Association, would be willing to actually publish a volume, a textbook in effect, that is on the fact that consciousness may be fundamental. That is a real breakthrough, and if that is the case, hopefully we will get more of these organizations.
The
willing
American
to publish
Psychological Association has also published 2 editions now of an anthology co-edited by Stanley Krippner called Anomalistic Psychology.
There we go. So that shows me that there is beginning to be a crack in this old worldview, and more scientists that do this sort of research are being willing, people are being willing to publish their data in major places like the APA.
Well, you as a female scientist are probably also aware of the prejudices or the difficulties that exist for women in science. And of course, that's not just science, it's across the board in all professions. And I saw a study not too long ago that said if women keep making progress at the rate they have been doing in recent decades, it will only be another 1,500 years before they have full equality.
Oh, that's a terrible thing to say. I hope that's not the case.
But I suspect for a field like parapsychology, these are related, that the suppression of women is somehow, in my mind, associated with the suppression of parapsychology, consciousness research, and related fields.
And you make a really good point. I think it's true that we have stereotypes in our society. And it's not just America, it's Europe, it's many societies, that women don't seem to have the same capabilities as men. And we see that, especially in our politics, for example, in our society, that that's so strong. And you just begin to think that, people are beginning to accept women in terms of total equality, at least some level, and then all of a sudden something happens that make you realize that that was just a superficial appearance. And there's this deep what we might call prejudice against women that people have not been able to overcome. And it's exactly the same as parapsychology. I totally agree with that. And I don't know quite what to say about that, except that the more we have major leaders in science, like, in fact, I would say Christoph Koch is one example, Roger Sperry, these other Nobel Prize winners, Eccles, beginning to say more and more about these types of things related to consciousness being fundamental, the more other people will say, wait a minute, this is a person at the leading edge of my field, and they believe this. Maybe I should at least be curious.
Yeah, especially young people.
Especially young people. And to me, the real word is curiosity. That if I could just ask the skeptic that I'm talking to be truly curious and go and look at those articles that they think they don't have time to look at, I think that they might actually begin to change their mind.
It seems to me that one of the tools of the skeptic, and I don't even think skeptic is the right word, because a philosophical skeptic is someone who questions themselves.
Yes.
But these people, Stanley Krippner likes to call them scoffers. And I think that's probably accurate, but they use the tool of sarcasm, derision, the horse laugh, the idea of just to embarrass them out of the academy. And I think that somehow needs to be addressed, that's not a valid approach when it comes to academic criticism. And yet I'm sure these people feel that it's perfectly justified because these areas of study are so far from the mainstream.
Right. And you're reminding me, too, that the way we can approach this is through the scientific method, which is the basis of all science anyway. And we can simply say, look at these articles, and can we, as the people doing research in parapsychology and near-death experiences, etc., be very careful to make our studies the gold standard of studies in that area. And then we say, okay, let my detractors look at my paradigm and say, how would you change it? In fact, in the Academy for the Advancement of Post-Materialist Sciences, this is one of the things we want to do. We want to say, okay, here's the paradigm that we want to use for this particular experiment on some aspect of parapsychology. I'm going to give it to the skeptic who might say that this cannot be true. Looking at my paradigm, is there anything you would do to change that paradigm to make it stronger so that you would accept the results that they come out positive? And if we can create a collaborative effort in that way, where we really let the skeptics say, okay, it needs to have this and this and this as part of it, that might also help then feel the need to accept the results when they actually come out.
In other words, what you're saying is that it's possible to do science in a way which is completely consistent with, let us say, the metaphysics of Kashmir Shaivism and the methodology of empirical science.
Exactly. And you're also reminding me, when I think about Ian Stevenson and his cases suggestive of reincarnation, he used the best legal interview techniques that we use when we're trying to decide if somebody has committed a crime or not. And if that's how we decide if somebody commits a crime or not and we consider it valid, why couldn't we take that and apply it also to cases suggestive of reincarnation? So if we can accept the methodology as something we use in other areas of our research, then it seems like it should be appropriate to then simply expand that into cases suggestive of reincarnation or near-death experiences.
So there are some people who would say that if you're going to explore consciousness, forget academia, forget the scientific method. It's a personal journey, which I know you've also been on. But what you're saying is no, we are going to interface with academia. We are going to embrace the scientific method and move forward that way.
Absolutely. And I think that's because, having been brought up as a scientist in this world, I can't accept that there are two different realities. I really believe there is one, and my scientific worldview had me putting blinders on so that I only saw one portion of reality. And I believe there's a lot more of reality out there. And as a scientist, I feel it's my responsibility to actually explore this and to make it part of my worldview. I would think that I would be perhaps not really being an appropriate scientist, taking on my responsibility to keep those blinders on if I believed there was more out there.
Marjorie Woollacott, what a delightful conversation. Yet again, thank you for sharing both your struggles and your accomplishments as a scientist working in this frontier area.
Thank you.
And thank you for being with us.